Welcome back to part 3 of our series on the inordinate amount of serial killers operating on America's highways. Today's case is the longest ongoing serial murder case I've ever covered. The Texas Killing Fields murders started back in 1971, with the last known death linked to that 25-acre patch of hell occurring in 2006. Located around the I-45 Interstate, about 30 miles from Houston, this rugged piece of land, smaller than most farms, is one of the most perfect places to murder on the move. Bayous, marshes, and oil fields, trees, bushes, and everything in between. A person can walk 10 feet from the road and be completely obscured by the wilderness. Of the 34 confirmed murders, the women and girls range in ages starting at just 12 years old to the oldest being 25. This is a rough one, and it stretches decades long. So let's take this from the top and start with the victims in the 70s and work our way up from there. Get a cup of joe, settle in, and let's get into it. Colette Anise Wilson, age 13, disappeared on June 17, 1971, after being dropped off by her band director at a bus stop so that she could go home after practice. In the 5 minutes that she was dropped off and her mother arrived to pick her up, Colette disappeared. The mother, Laura, assumed that Colette had gone to a nearby friend's house, and on her way to go check, she noticed a car on the side of the road. Police never bothered to record the car's make and model. Colette's body was found 4 months later, 40 miles away from where she'd gone missing, in what would later become known as the Texas Killing Fields. She'd been decapitated. 3 months later came Rhonda Renee Johnson, 14, and Sharon Lynn Shaw, 13. The friends were found a year later, dumped in the marshes of the killing fields. 2 months after that, on the 28th of October, Gloria Ann Gonzalez, 19 years old, was reported missing. Her remains were found a month later, just yards from where Colette's body was found. A week later, Allison Ann Craven, age 12, went missing after her mother sent her to pick up groceries. Allison's partial remains were found 3 months after she went missing, and it took nearly a year to collect the rest that was scattered over a 15-mile circumference. Debbie Catherine Ackerman and Marie Talbot Johnson, a pair of 15-year-olds on their way to an ice cream shop, took a ride from a male driving a white pickup truck when they were last seen on the 15th of November, just a week after Allison went missing. Their bodies were found 2 days later, nude, bound, and assaulted. It went quiet for 2 years, just enough for the surrounding towns to start breathing easy again. But then Kimberly Ray Pitchford, age 16, went missing on January the 16th, 1973. She was last seen leaving a driving test at her high school and was found 2 days later lying in a ditch with a pair of teenage boys. Still, this was a one-time event with no other missing teens reported for the next year. Brooks Bracewell, 12, and Georgia Carolina Gear, 14, disappeared in early September 1974, but despite there now being 9 missing female teenagers in the area in the last 3 years, most of them under the age of 16, police insisted that these two were runaways. The girls' bodies were discovered 2 years later, just 30 miles away from where they were last seen, and police still didn't make the connection. They weren't identified for another 10 years until another detective that actually wanted to do his job picked up the case. The killer had kicked off 1971 with a bang, but he was now starting to slow down somewhat. The result was that the police started looking into cases as individual events and not one connected series of murders committed by the same person or persons. Suzanne Susie Bowers disappeared in May of '77 on a 3-minute walk home from her grandmother's house. Her body was located 2 years later. The 70s concluded with 12 victims, the oldest being 19 years old, and the youngest had turned 12 just a month before her disappearance. The majority of the remains wouldn't be found for years yet, and then they'd be too decomposed to get much information from them. But those bodies that were found quickly enough were sexually assaulted. Most were thought to have been smothered or strangled because they showed no outward injuries, with the exception of Colette Anise Wilson, who'd been shot in the head. The only lead they had was the white pickup truck that picked up Debbie and Maria, and a mystery car that was seen close to Colette's last known whereabouts. Not that it would have mattered much. No one was raising the alarm bells yet. Even today, very few people even know about a killer that targets children and who is one of the most prolific child killers on the planet. 1980 came and went with no new murders. Then, in January of 1981, Tina Gail Klaus, 17, Harold Dean Klaus Jr., 21, and their baby daughter went missing. The newlyweds' remains were found when someone's dog brought Tina's skull out of the marshes. Their infant daughter, Holly, was not found among the remains. Tina had been strangled while Harold was beaten to death. Miraculously, little Holly was found in 2022, all grown up. The killer had left her on a church's doorstep, and she was adopted by a pastor and his wife. Another year came and went before the body of Michelle Angela Garvey was found. She'd run away from home at the age of 14. In June of '82, just a few days before her 15th birthday. A month later, she was found in the killing field, assaulted and strangled. 20-year-old Susan Lee Eads went missing in August of '83. She was found the next day, beaten, assaulted, and strangled with her own clothes. Her case was solved thanks to DNA and seems to be unrelated to the others. Her killer, identified as Arthur Raymond Davis Jr., continued to call Susan's mother for the next 2 years until his death in a vehicular collision. It wasn't until the 2000s that DNA matched to him. The killings went on long after he died, and no other victim found in the fields ever had the occurrence of the killer contacting their parents. Heidi Marie Villarreal Fye, a cocktail waitress, was abducted in October of '83 while she was at work. She'd walked over to a payphone in front of a convenience store during a break and was kidnapped on that short 2-minute walk. Just 2 months later, 16-year-old Laura Miller was walking past the same convenience store on her way to that same payphone when she disappeared too. Laura's disappearance was one of the few that made headlines. She had a serious seizure condition that required a high level of care. The emergent nature of her condition definitely added to the high level of interest in her case. To hone down that this had to be the same killer, both Laura and Heidi were found next to each other a year later in a field near League, Texas, by a group of boys riding their dirt bikes. 14-year-old Sonja K. Ramber rounded off 1983. She was kidnapped from her home in Santa Fe, Texas in October, and her remains have never been found. This went quiet again for 2 years, and like last time, these periods of cooling stopped people from making the connection that there was a serial killer operating in and around Texas. Every time that enough girls go missing to start raising suspicions, the killer stops cold turkey for a year or two until the heat dies down. In 1985, 17-year-old Michelle Doherty Thomas and 30-year-old Audrey Lee Cook went missing, both while they went out with friends for the evening. Before you think that maybe they aren't related to the others, both of their bodies were found in the exact location where Laura and Heidi were found, and like last time, they were placed just feet from each other. Of the 4 victims found in that small space, 1 was shot, 1 was strangled. The other 2's causes of death could not be determined, and these 4 wouldn't be the only ones found in that 20 yards of grassland. So, the killer wasn't too picky about age. His victims ranged between 12 and 30 years old. He'd used multiple ways to kill them, including a firearm, strangulation, and drowning, and he'd made sure to kidnap them from the same places and to dump them in the same locations. How many more flashing neon red lights do police need before they put the pieces together that there's a serial killer in Texas? 22 victims, all missing from Texas, all nude and all dumped in the same 25 acres of land. Some so close together that they would have been able to reach out and touch each other if they'd been alive. Apparently, that wasn't enough to convince police that there was any such thing as a child murderer out there. Shelley Kathleen Sykes, 19, went missing in May of '86 after leaving her waitressing job for the night. Her car was found in the parking lot, its windows smashed in, and the interior was covered in Shelley's blood. She was never found. 2 years later, in 1988, 22-year-old Suzanne Renee Rikerson started her shift as a night clerk at the Casa del Mar condominiums on Seawall Boulevard in Galveston, Texas. A guest heard her scream during the night. a car door slam, and the sound of it speeding away. When the guest went down to report it to the front desk, but the office was turned upside down and the pretty girl who'd been sitting there had vanished. Suzanne's body has not been located either. Last of the 80s victims was Cheryl Ann Martin, a 33-year-old newlywed whose remains were found under a bridge in 1989. Cheryl was older than most of the victims, but her remains yielded some clues. An item that was used to strangle her was at the scene, and police were able to extract DNA from it. It hasn't been matched to anyone yet, though. In 1991, 34-year-old Donna Marie Prudhomme, a transient woman, was found right in the same place where Heidi, Laura, Michelle, and Audrey were found. She'd been deceased for no more than 6 weeks when they found her, though no cause of death could be determined. It's after Donna's remains were found, tallying up to 5 victims found inside a space that was smaller than a tennis court, that police were forced to admit that there was a serial killer around Texas when reporters badgered them enough about it. At first, they wouldn't admit to any of the children, just that these 5 were connected. But they changed their tune after public pressure became too much to ignore. Donna's case was unusual. She was homeless, older, and did not fit the profile of any of the other victims. And her remains were found years after the first 4. Police just had a feeling that this was a coincidence. They felt that the first 4 were killed by the same person, but Donna was completely unrelated. And they were right. I'm not a fan of coincidences, not at all. But after 34 murders, it's not unrealistic to think that somewhere they'd overlap. The man who confessed, with stark detail, was Mark Stallings. He also admitting to killing 30-year-old Audrey Cook and is suspected in murdering 2 more women around the same age in a different state. If you're keeping count, we've reached 26 confirmed victims so far. And again, things died down for a few years. This time, 4 years of silence was enough for the world to forget about the killing fields and the frightening amount of victims piling up there. In February of 1996, Lynette Bibbs, 14, and Tamara Fisher, 15, went missing after spending a night at a club designated for teenagers. We don't have these anymore, but teen clubs with music and chaperones were a big thing back in the day to encourage teenagers to enjoy music and dancing under watchful eyes to keep them off the streets. The girls were shot, execution style, and dumped on the side of a rural road 2 days later. A month later, Crystal Jean Baker, just 13, went missing after walking to a convenience store to use the telephone. She definitely arrived and made the call, but she vanished on the 10-minute walk back home. She was dropped over a bridge into the Trinity River 2 hours later, assaulted and strangled. Crystal's case is interesting for several reasons. First, Marilyn Monroe was her great aunt. But most importantly, her murder gave rise to the Crystal Jean Baker Act, which permits the collection of DNA from individuals arrested for certain felonies prior to conviction. Her killer was identified as Kevin Edison Smith 16 years later, but we'll get back to the suspects in just a second. The 90s weren't done with surprises just yet. 1997 saw the murders of 3 victims: Kelly Ann Cox, 20 years old, Jessica Lee Kane, 17 years old, and 12-year-old Laura Smither. Serial killer and native Texan William Lewis Reece was convicted of all 3 murders. In 2001, 57-year-old Tot Tran Harriman disappeared somewhere within the Killing Fields area after a road trip to visit her son. Sarah Ann Lewis Trusty, 23 years old, went missing in 2002 and was found a few days later floating in a reservoir. The last victim was 16-year-old Teresa Lynn Venegas, who was found 3 days later after her disappearance, brutally assaulted, her hair cut off, and strangled in a field in front of a high school. Teresa brings the official total up to 34 victims that we know of, not counting nearly a dozen women and girls whose remains have been found but not identified through the years. But there are a few that we can separate right off the bat. Shelley Kathleen Sykes, who went missing in '86 after apparently being abducted from her car, is technically solved. 2 men named Robert John King and Gerald Peter Zwarst admitted to abducting and assaulting Shelley. Neither man could point out to investigators where they'd hidden her body, and there's serious accusations of coercion during their interrogations. Neither man had ever committed a crime against women that was even remotely similar. Even without a body, they were given life behind bars on the basis of their confessions. This case, in my opinion, has a great deal of holes in it, and I think that Shelley still deserves to be on the list. Crystal Jean Baker's murder was solved thanks to DNA, and her murder was also unusual in the sense that her body was dropped from a bridge, an unusual method of disposal for the killing fields. Then there's the matter of the proven and convicted killer, William Lewis Reece, who admitted to killing Tiffany Johnston, Laura Smither, and Kelly Cox, and possibly Jessica Kane, cannot be responsible for all of the other murders, not even close. He started murdering in 1997, nearly 30 years after the first murders started happening. He was in high school in the 70s, and a great chunk of the 80s and early 90s was spent in prison. It's all but certain that these 3 murders, maybe as many as 4 or 5, were what he was responsible for. He was fairly forthcoming about what he had done to these 3 women, yet denied any involvement with others in the area when questioned about it. A man named Edward Harold Bell was convicted of murdering a Marine in 1998, admitted to prosecutors that he killed 11 girls back in Texas in the 1970s. He made this confession without ever being a suspect or being prompted to do so. He named Kimberly Pitchford, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, Colette Wilson, Rhonda Johnson, and Sharon Shaw as some of his victims. Bell died in prison in 2019. There was never any evidence to link him to the murders. Back in 1972, police brought in Michael Lloyd Self, a convicted sex offender in the area, for those first murders that started all of this. The police chief and several other police officers were later convicted for torturing suspects. We're not talking about simple coerced confessions. These animals beat the living daylights out of many people, forcing them to admit to crimes that they never committed. Michael Self was a sleazeball. There's no doubt about that. But it's highly unlikely that he killed the 2 women he was put in prison for. He died in prison where he's been since 1972, so it definitely wasn't him either. William Lewis Reece and Mark Stalling are the only definitive serial killers on this list. Reece accounts for 4 of the child victims. After that, he was in prison for the remainder of the killing field's history. And Stalling killed older women. He was not a predator of children, nor had he ever attacked a child before. This still leaves us with 20 to 25 dead women and girls in the space of 3 decades. So what does all of this have to do with our series on highway murderers? Well, most of the girls were abducted miles away and brought to this small stretch of 25 acres of land, specifically for the purpose of disposing of their bodies right there and nowhere else. So this person definitely had reason to drive through here a lot. But given the 60 miles radius of locations where he kidnapped his victims from, all along the I-45 highway, that makes it almost certain that he's a truck driver, a salesman, or a delivery driver of some kind who works in this area. Outside of 2 coerced confessions and 2 separate serial killers who couldn't have killed the others, we've got nothing. Just 2 sightings of a white truck back in the 70s and 80s, and a few bullets that have no gun to match them to. The last death occurred in 2002. That's 23 years ago. At this point, all we can hope for is that the killer's finally died and is burning in hell, or that a deathbed confession blows this whole thing wide open. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do know that we have more than 20 girls dead, just kids, who should have been living long, happy lives. Most of them would have been grandmothers by now. But instead of justice, there's just nothing. No theories, no probable suspects, and not a shred of evidence. This is not a coincidence. Nearly 30 deaths is not natural, and the circumstances are too similar to ignore. All we can do now is pray that the Texas killing fields remain dormant. Outside of wartime battlefields, no other stretch of ground has seen as much death as these few acres. What do you think? Have the killing fields truly seen the last of its terrible young victims, or is it only a matter of time before the hidden marshes and grasses reveal another string of cruel and senseless death? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And leave a like and a comment while you're at it. It's your engagement that keeps the lights on over here at Evidence Obscured. You are the reason that our team can bring you human-produced content. See you in the next one, people.